Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, and thank you to Simon and Bill for having me back for another talk. It's nice to see lots of familiar names and faces on the screen. So I'm going to talk to you a bit tonight about the Brilliant Butterflies project, which is a project I've been the Nature Reserves Officer on for the last 2.5 years. So just to give you a heads up of what's coming up, I'll talk to you a little bit about London Wildlife Trust, just a short introduction. Many of you might be familiar with them and their work. Talk a little bit about London's chalk landscape, how that fits in to the Brilliant Butterflies project. Give a quick little introduction for anybody who's not familiar with the project, and then give an update on what we've been doing, what we've been up to, and our achievements so far. And then, as Simon said, at the end, we will have time for questions. So London Wildlife Trust is the only charity organisation solely dedicated to supporting, promoting, protecting London's wildlife and nature. They're in charge of 36 nature reserves, a total of 476 hectares, and over 15,000 species of plants, animals and fungi can be found in those places. So this map just gives you a kind of overview. Part of London Wildlife Trust's vision for London is that it's alive with nature that can be enjoyed by everyone. And a big part of that is creating this living landscape. So expanding existing natural areas and linking them up with each other by sort of creating these corridors of habitat and wildlife in order to help spread the nature across London. So you can start to see here the different areas across London where the focus of the work is. And the three large London boroughs just at the bottom here are, from the right, Bromley, Croydon and Sutton. And where it says they're chalking up London's downs in a sort of faint pink, that's the area that we'll be focusing on this evening as part of the project. And we have several nature reserves in this area. So this shows you the kind of spread of London Wildlife Trust's nature reserves across London. And these 5 highlighted here are the ones that were earmarked as part of the Brilliant Butterflies project, along with an additional reserve, which was on loan from Surrey Wildlife Trust, which was Dollopers Hill, which is found in Old Toulston. And all of these reserves, the 6 reserves, have significant chunks of chalk grassland, and I'll talk about them individually a bit later on and the sort of importance of them, but I'll just talk now for a little bit about chalk habitats and why these are so important. So this cross section here just shows you kind of a slice through London, as it were, and it shows you this purple area at the top here is essentially London, and it's sitting in this chalky basin. That pale green is the chalk area, and it surfaces in the south in Croydon, Bromley and Sutton, as I've mentioned, kind of along there, and then goes all the way out to Kent. If you think about the coast along there, the White Cliffs of Dover, that's where the chalk is coming out to the surface there, and it comes all the way through here. And then in the north, in areas such as Dunstable Downs and into the Chiltern Hills, that's where that chalk surfaces again. So we've got these chalk habitats either side of London, sort of enveloping it, as it were. And as you can imagine, these chalky habitats aren't quite what they were, what they will have been in the past. They've been subject to urban development as well as agricultural pressures, and so the large areas of chalk downland that might have been here don't exist to a large extent anymore. And in fact, we've lost 80% of the chalk grassland habitat in the UK in the last 75 years. So it's a significant chunk. But why is that so important? Why does that matter? It's an extremely biodiverse habitat, as many of you will know if you've visited any of the chalk grassland reserves, and it can have up to 40 different species just in 1 square metre. But it does rely on a delicate balance of factors. So it needs, most importantly, this very low nutrient soil. So it doesn't need high nutrients at all. It's very low nutrient topsoil sitting on top of that chalky bedrock. The grass is very short and got plenty of bare areas for the seeds to germinate in. The water drains away really quickly, and it heats up really quickly in the sun. When you've got all these factors working together, it means that you get this rich diversity of flora, and in turn that then attracts the butterflies and other invertebrates that rely on those flowers. The way we manage the chalk grassland reserves is through a mixture of grazing, so these living lawn mowers, sheep provided by the Downlands Partnership. We have those on some areas of some of our reserves, and in areas where we don't have them, we rely on human power. So cutting with hand tools and with machinery, and then removing that cut vegetation so that those nutrients don't go back into that soil. So that's just kind of a brief overview of how we manage the habitat. And just a quick sort of species snapshot of some of the butterfly species that the project is aiming at. So the small blue butterfly, the smallest UK butterfly, it's a priority species for Croydon, and Hutchinson's Bank, which was in the background of Simon's picture just at the start there, is one of the best places in the country to find this species. But it's a fussy little butterfly. It will only lay on this plant here, the kidney vetch, which is part of the project. We've been trying to expand the range of that food plant. Then at the other end of the size scale, we've got the dark green fritillary, the largest of the 9 fritillary butterflies found in the UK. Again, it's a bit of a fussy one, so it only lays its eggs on violet species, such as the common dog violet, which thrives on sort of shady but chalky habitats as well. And then the marbled white, the sort of quintessential species of chalk grassland habitats, but now also having expanded its range across London. It's a real success story. It doesn't lay its eggs on knapweed from this picture, but it does enjoy perching and feeding on knapweed. It lays its eggs on lots of different grass species, which is part of the reason why it will have been more successful, because it's not so fussy as its 2 neighbours. I'm just going to show you a short video now that just gives a glimpse of some of the habitats that I've been talking about. Hopefully it will play. Sorry, let me just move it on. Okay, so hopefully that just gave you a little glimpse of some of the habitats, and you could start to see where the ideas started to come from for why the Brilliant Butterflies project was important to try and protect, enhance, restore and expand these habitats that were already there. So the first ideas came from, as Simon mentioned, these kind of 3 powerhouse conservation organisations: London Wildlife Trust, Butterfly Conservation and the Natural History Museum, coming together to put forward a proposal to the People's Postcode Lottery and what's known as their Dream Fund. And so we were then awarded a 2-year project with a grant of £1 million. So it means that we've been on a 2.5-year spending spree, which has been very enjoyable. So initially at the start of the project, this was our working area. So the green areas on here are the nature reserves that I've talked about so far, the 6 nature reserves. And the areas highlighted in the sort of sandy colour were areas that we were hoping to work and to expand the short grassland by creating some new habitats, some new habitat islands to help increase the spread of butterflies. So what can happen with butterflies quite quickly is that their populations, if they start to shrink, the health of the population becomes quite diminished, and then that's what then leads to them, the populations getting smaller and smaller, and what can lead to them eventually dying out in a particular area. So by expanding these chalk grassland habitats, it means that we can help the distribution of the butterflies to spread, and therefore increase the health of these populations that are there. So our targets, the ambitious targets set out, were to create new habitats. So the original target was to create 40 new habitats, to restore the chalk grasslands on those 6 nature reserves, to engage with 3,400 people. So the original target before COVID was to try and engage 4,400 people, but because of COVID and all the sort of restrictions that entailed, People's Postcode Lottery reduced that to 3,400. Another target to develop a social butterflies program. So that's sort of an engagement program, various different ways of trying to get local communities involved with the project and with their local green spaces. The last 2 were the sort of focus of the Natural History Museum, to train citizen scientists in different techniques for surveying insects. Butterfly conservation also, the hope was that they would be involved in training people with butterfly transects and monitoring as well. And then the final one there, the surveying using eDNA, or environmental DNA techniques, which was a real pioneering approach that was being trialled as part of this project. And with the injection of cash, it meant that that could take place, and that they could try out lots of new techniques. So this really was sort of cutting edge conservation work. So the first target, to create these new butterfly habitats. We've employed a variety of different approaches to creating butterfly habitats, and it's been a mixture of banks and scrapes. So the first 2 pictures on the left-hand side here, it's kind of a before and after of one of the first approaches. This is at Selsdon Recreation Ground in Croydon. And this is an example of a soil inversion. So what happens is the machinery will come in and scrape away that fertile topsoil. As I mentioned, it's this we want low fertility. So the fertile topsoil is scraped away and put to one side. Then the second layer, which is this subsoil, which is much lower in nutrients and far better for growing chalk grass and plants, that's then scraped away and put to one side. The more fertile topsoil is then put back in, and the less fertile subsoil is then put on top. So you've got this much lower fertility sitting on the top, and that can then be seeded with chalk grassland plants or plug planted, and you can create a much more successful wildflower meadow than if you just scraped back the topsoil, or if you just sprinkled seeds and planted directly into that fertile soil. So that was one of the methods that we used. Another method was on the right-hand side there. You can see a chalk bank, and the 2 bottom pictures there just show the kind of in progress shots of those banks being created. So that involves scraping back again that fertile topsoil, and ideally removing that, putting it somewhere else. It's great for tree growth. So if you've got an area where trees are growing, if it can be put in that sort of area, then but move it away from the bank. Then pile up that subsoil layer underneath and put chalk on top. So we had chalk imported to the sites, and some of our contractors brought that on, and then it was sort of piled and very artistically, in many cases, created into these banks. And the reason for a bank in a lot of the places is that it creates these sort of microclimates. So the temperature will vary depending on whereabouts on the bank you are. So only very slightly, but enough to be quite pleasing to butterflies. So they obviously enjoy very warm temperatures. So if you can create those microclimates, then they're more likely to come to the banks. So the one in the bottom left-hand corner is probably my favourite one of the project that's created, a butterfly-shaped scrape. So this was kind of a combination of scraping away that fertile topsoil, and then rather than a bank, just putting the chalky layer on top in the shape of a butterfly. And all of these areas have since been either plug planted or seeded with various chalk grassland plants, and they are in the process of establishing, and hopefully within a couple of years they will be well established. The butterfly one is on South Croydon recreation ground, if you ever want to go and visit, and the other bank just there on the right hand side is in the grounds of Applegarth School. So quite a few of the banks we put into school grounds so that the children could be involved and hopefully start doing some butterfly monitoring of their own once the butterflies start to appear. So on that note, another sort of branch of this creation of the butterfly banks and scrapes was that we really tried to involve local communities and get them involved in being the custodians of these banks, because although London Wildlife Trust can kind of oversee the banks in the future and the scrapes in the future, it was really important that we knew that they were going to be maintained by either friends groups or by school communities or local residents groups. So wherever possible, we got those people involved in planting the banks with little plug plants. We had planting events. The top photo in the middle there was a planting day that project manager Kat did at Milne Park, which is in Sutton. So getting people out for the day so that they can kind of start taking ownership of these new habitats. So it was a mixture of seeding and plug planting, as I said, of plants like kidney vetch, which was the small blue butterfly caterpillar's food plant, marjoram, wild thyme, knapweed. Lots of these won't flower in their first year, so it does take a while for the banks to establish, and that's was a big part of sort of our engagement, was to make sure that we were communicating with people that it wasn't going to be a riot of colour straight away, that it was very much a work in progress, and that we needed them to sort of be mindful of that and take care of it until it was more established. And we also put up signs wherever possible around the sites, just to let people know what had happened, so they didn't just think it was, you know, a hole in the ground or a bank of dirt, that it was actually a habitat that would soon come into life with its wildflowers and all the insects that would hopefully benefit from that. So it was sort of that communication was a very important part of installing these habitats as well. So this is what the situation looks like at the end of the project. This is our project area now, so significantly larger than that first picture I showed you of where we were hoping to put habitats in. The red markers show the nature reserves, and the blue markers all represent a new butterfly habitat that has been created. So initially we had a target of 40, and we've actually ended up with 45 new butterfly habitats created across the project area. And we've managed to expand into a third borough as well. So initially Bromley on the right hand side here and into Croydon, and then we also managed to do some banks in Sutton, where there had already been quite a lot of work gone on to their chalk grassland reserves to try and encourage butterflies and invertebrates. So it made sense for us to be able to put in some extra chalk banks to help support the work that was already going on there, and to help grow our project area. So these little blue flags all represent these little chalky habitat islands that will help for the butterfly populations to spread and grow, hopefully. So the other target was to restore the chalk grassland habitat. So this was largely based around the 6 nature reserves and largely involved volunteers. And we've been so lucky with the project. We've had so many incredible volunteers. We've had over 100 volunteers come through doing volunteer sessions with us, and they've come out in all weathers onto all the reserves. And it's been a real privilege to be able to spend so much time out with them, and they've just given 100%, and it's been a mixture of tasks, sort of maintaining the butterfly banks and clearing the meadows. So we've trained quite a few of the volunteers in the use of scythes. So you can see the picture sort of in the centre here on the bottom, and 2 of the volunteers using the scythes, which is a great way for us to get the meadows cut and for volunteers to learn a new skill. So it's considered a bit of an old-fashioned way, I guess, of cutting meadows, but the volunteers have really enjoyed it, and it means we can have quite a few people working in the same area at once and get quite large areas of the meadows cut, which is a hefty task in August and September time when we have such large areas to cut. So it's been a great thing to be involved with these volunteer sessions. We've also had a lot of support from a fellow project at London Wildlife Trust, is the Keeping It Wild project, which recruits trainees from underrepresented backgrounds and gives them paid employment in the conservation sector for 3 or 4 months. And so we've been lucky enough to have lots of the trainees come out with us onto the South Reserves and the Brilliant Butterflies project. And they've been hugely supportive as well in getting quite a lot of the practical work done. Another arm of the restoration work has been to work with contractors. So the picture that Simon showed you in the beginning there, which was of Hutchinson's Bank, is another example of the kind of large scale contractor work that we've been able to achieve as part of this project. Where the trust doesn't have immediate access to large machinery all the time. So if we can use, wherever possible, we can use contractors to utilise their machinery for, in this case, scraping those large amounts of earth back and piling up and manoeuvring that large amount of chalk. So it's had that's had a huge impact on these reserves. The visible difference we've been able to make has been incredible. And this is another 2 examples here. So on the right hand side, this picture shows a newly laid path at Hutchinson's Bank. It's made it much more accessible now. It's a much more pleasant experience to walk along that path than it used to be. And on the left hand side here, we've got a new partnership which has come about as part of the project, and that's with an organisation called Operation Centaur, and they're a charity who work with heavy horses, with Shire horses, and use them in different conservation settings. So they're based out of the Royal Parks, so out in Richmond and Hampton Court, and they have several Shire horses that they take to different settings around London to complete conservation work. And it's really vital. Shire horses are a breed that aren't used as much now, and so their numbers are diminishing, and so the work that Operation Centaur will do really helps to support the breed and maintain these kind of working horses. And we use them on Hutchinson's Bank to get some of our meadow areas cut where we don't have any grazing and where it's quite difficult to get machinery in. And then this horse in the photo here, or the video that I'm going to show you in a moment, is Murdoch, and he was on site to pull out some dumped golf carts and motorbikes. So for several years we've had motorbikes and a golf cart driven onto the site and then just dumped, and they're extremely heavy. They're not the sort of thing that we could move out or that volunteers could move very easily at all. But we had Murdoch on site who made it look very easily. So I'll just get this little video to play.
End of an era for that golf cart.
Never found that MOT looking like this.
So that was last summer as part of our big butterfly festival. So we had did it as kind of part of a community engagement event as well, where we invited as many members of the public who wanted to come down and see the horses at work. And it was a really lovely event, because it's not often that people get to be up close with these horses. So it was really nice for people to be able to meet them, and the handlers were there to kind of talk through the kind of work that they do, and really it was a great event. This is another example of the kind of contractor work. So I mentioned the bank that Simon showed. That's at the bottom of Hutchinson's Bank. This is at the top end, at an entrance that's not a particularly attractive entrance. It's right next to a recycling plant. We get lots of rubbish dumped, as you can see in this first picture on the left hand side. This was the before photo, and then one of our contractors came in, sort of scraped back all of that topsoil again, removed all of that rubbish. We brought a lot of chalk in, so we've created one of these chalky butterfly banks right at the entrance there to welcome people to the site. And the last picture there on the right hand side is of it in full bloom. So it was in flower until very late in the autumn, so there was still flowers on there in November. We had lots of greater knapweed, and it was a really great nectar source for lots of the bees that were still around at that point. And so it will continue to establish, and more of the chalk grassland plants will now start to come through there. And so we've also got some new signage going in on the site as well, which will let people know they've reached the reserve, because it's not always clear with Hutchinson's Bank that you're on a nature reserve, but it will also signpost people from the local transport. So Hutchinson's Bank is only a couple of minutes walk from New Addington tram stop, so if we can signpost people from the tram, we think it will really help to bring people down onto the reserve. Quite a large-scale project that we've been doing, which has been a collaboration between contractors and volunteers and graziers, has been at Riddlesdown Common. So if you know the site, it's a large expanse, the largest expanse, in fact, of chalk grassland in Greater London. It's a really wonderful site, and London Wildlife Trust has a tiny little sliver of it marked out here in red that we manage. So the rest of the site is managed by the City of London, but this little red section is London Wildlife Trust, and it's become quite isolated. It was very difficult to access. It was hard to get there with any sort of machinery to manage it. There was no way any sort of grazing could take place in there. So as part of this project, it was decided that a change needed to happen, and that we were going to try and create a new access route. So this is kind of zoomed in on that red section, and the main area is where the meadow is, and then we wanted to create a new access route out to an existing footpath. So the top photo here on the left hand side shows the kind of before photo of the access route that we were facing, and so it was a very long-term project aim, and many sessions with very enthusiastic volunteers, it has to be said, to clear that access route. And we now have a fully clear pathway, as you can see in these bottom pictures here. It's now been completely fenced, it's stock proof, and we have got sheep going in there in a couple of weeks' time, and we're going to have an opening ceremony. So it really is a project success story. It's been great to see it through from the sort of planning stages where we were, it's Riddlesdown is a triple SI, so we needed to let Natural England know what our plans were, and they were fine with it and agreed that it was a good use of the space, and then to go from that point all the way through in the different stages, and to now have it at a point where we can get sheep in there and start properly restoring that chalk grassland is really quite special. So moving on to one of the other targets, to engage as many people as possible, which was quite difficult when COVID hit, because obviously butterflies are outdoors, and so we had to kind of switch tack a little bit quite quickly when everybody was in lockdown. But we utilised various different avenues to engage with as many people as possible, and that included through newsletters. So this top left-hand picture is of one of the volunteering newsletters. We also had a social engagement newsletter which went out, trying to make it as interactive as possible, getting people involved, sending in their pictures, letting us know what wildlife they had in their local area. We had quizzes and stories, and that the newsletters have carried on. The volunteer newsletter is still something that goes out weekly. This picture in the top right hand corner is of a moth ID live. So Dr. Phil Sterling, who is part of who is a moth expert, and so each week on Fridays, as part of the project and part of a wider butterfly conservation social engagement, would do Moth ID Live, where himself and several other people who've put out moth traps in their areas would then showcase the moths to everybody and let them know about the ID of them, the particular behaviours and the habitats that they're found in. So it was a really valuable way, in the absence of being able to get people out to physical moth traps, to be able to share that knowledge was it really incredible. in the bottom right hand corner here, we've got sort of art workshops. We did online art workshops. We've got a quiz down here in the bottom left hand corner. We also utilize social media. So in the middle here, we've got project manager Catherine and Steve Bolton in the background there, who some of you might have seen in a previous talk, who's now working on the Big City Butterflies project for butterfly conservation. So he was largely responsible for lots of the amazing work that happened on the Brilliant Butterflies projects, particularly with regards to the banks and the scrapes that were created. So he was very much in charge of those and instrumental in getting such a wide range of different habitats created, and also got involved in social media. So another arm of the engagement of people was that we wanted to try and get those who were less keen on visiting the nature reserves to still engage with the project and with the idea of butterflies and local nature and green spaces. So we did that through various activities, and one of those was to do craft sessions. So these were needle felting sessions, which is a craft where you sort of repeatedly stab wool to make it turn into felt. And so we were creating butterfly brooches, and some of the wool that we used was actually from the sheep on Hutchinson's Bank. So it was a great way to kind of introduce people to the idea that they've got sheep on their doorstep. And through those sessions, we would then sort of introduce them to different butterfly species and talk about the different aspects of the project. So, and then often we'd get people sort of engaging with us in other ways, who might then come out on a guided walk, or who would then sign up to our newsletter. So it was a good way in for some people who weren't initially so keen on being in the outdoors. Engaging with young people was obviously a huge target of the project. They're going to be the next custodians of these butterfly banks and nature reserves and green spaces all across the city. So wanting to inspire them to want to get out and see their green spaces, as well as want to protect them and think about the species that could be found there, was really important for us. So we had two community engagement officers, Sanita and Laura, who were largely responsible for getting out into schools and running sessions, informing them about butterflies, taking them on guided walks out onto the nature reserves, out onto Hutchinson's Bank and the other surrounding reserves, and running bushcraft sessions in the woods, so getting them making fires and dens, which obviously they all loved. We also ran several activity days where there was face painting and various butterfly crafts that children could come and get involved in, and then while they're sort of entertained doing that, we can talk to parents about the project and how they might like to get involved, or what other things their children can get involved in. This photo in the middle at the bottom is of a homeschool group. So over quite a long time, Sanita and Laura built up a really strong relationship with a homeschool group. So these are children who aren't in mainstream education, but who have education provided by a parent or carer, and that can involve different sessions in outdoor locations or other activity centres. And so they built up a programme of activities for these children to take part in, which included things like the bushcraft and various outdoor activities, guided walks. So it was a great partnership that came out of the Hutchinson's Bank. We had 22 people, and it was quite a miserly day, so it was a really good turnout for such bad weather. But that's been a bit of the story of the project. Every time we seem to take a walk, it will be some kind of rain, whether it's warm rain or sideways rain or really heavy rain. We've had it all, but people will always come, whatever the weather. People will come and be keen to explore these reserves. So it's been great to have so many opportunities to do that. A big part of our engagement last summer was the Big Butterfly Week, which was sort of a festival week that we had planned to do in the first summer in 2020 and obviously couldn't. So then last year we decided to do a full week of various activities across all of the different project sites and reserves, trying to engage as many people as we could. So we had walks, we had talks, we had craft activities, we had Meet the Farmer, where we had our graziers from the Downlands project and also from the City of London, talking about the animals that they look after and what their jobs are, and introducing children and adults to these wonderful creatures. We had big bug hunts happening, so some of the Natural History Museum staff were leading on big bug hunts, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment. So it really was a real celebration of the project. The photos here make it look like it was sunny all week. It wasn't. It was really quite bad weather for most of the week. But we still went out. We utilised as many pockets of sunshine as we could. And in fact, one of my favourite moments of the week was leading a guided walk again with project manager Kat, and it was pouring with rain when we set off from New Addington tram stop, and we still had quite a handful of people who still wanted to come out. And the first hour it continued to pour down, and then the sun came out, and the second hour was beautiful. We saw loads of butterflies, and just as we were finishing up, a purple emperor just fluttered past our heads. So it really was that fly past, but made it all worth it. So it's always worth going out, rain or shine, I think. So I mentioned there about the Natural History Museum doing their big bug hunts. So part of their engagement activities involved taking out groups of children and adults to show them the different survey techniques that they use. So pitfall traps, malaise traps, which is this trap that's pictured here. It looks a bit like a tent on the bottom left-hand side, and just getting them to look really carefully at what they could find on the grassland reserve. So all the different insects, and it was a really good opportunity for it's just kind of a screenshot from that, and it's available to download free from the Natural History Museum website. It's a really great guide that kind of helps with being able to identify lots of different invertebrates, so not just butterflies, but beetles and flies, and looking up the different body types and what makes them the kind of insect that they are. So that's a really great resource to have as well. Now to the slightly more complex end of the Natural History Museum's involvement, and that's, as I mentioned, in eDNA, environmental DNA. So it really was cutting edge science, as I mentioned, that was taking place as part of the project. And I'll be honest, it is complicated. Lots of it went over my head. We did a workshop at the Natural History Museum a couple of weeks ago to kind of try and get up to speed with everything. And it is quite mind-blowing, as you'll see with some of the things, the results that I'm going to share with you. But hopefully it's really exciting stuff, and it's only in its very early stages. So the process begins by samples being taken from invertebrates and the soil. So the different samples that are taken are soil samples. So they collect different samples from each of our chalk grassland reserves, and also from some of the butterfly banks that were created. They also do pitfall traps, which is like a little cup inserted into the ground, and then ground dwelling insects will fall into that cup and they can be collected. And then this bottom one, as I mentioned, it looks a bit like a tent. These are called malaise traps, and that's for aerial flying invertebrates who fly into that and then get collected in a tub at the top there. So the three different ways that they were surveying on all of our nature reserves, as well as on some of the butterfly banks. And those samples are then prepared for extraction. So the Natural History Museum decided to use whole invertebrate samples. So rather than mincing everything up into a mixture, they were using whole samples. So each invertebrate was kept whole. So there might have been several within a mixture, but they were kept whole. And then the DNA is extracted, and it can be matched to different species, with the idea being that the data is then used to create a whole library of DNA that can be used for future investigations. So those reference libraries are in the process of being built up now. And the idea is then that we can have greater understanding of the diversity on our sites, and then start to manage the sites appropriately for specific species if that's what's necessary. So, oops, as you can see from this slide, this is the kind of complexity of the results that are being gained. So this mind-blowing pie chart is the different kind of families of species that can be found. This is just from one site. So West Kent Golf Course is one of the chalk grassland reserves that is part of the project, and on that site, from their eDNA surveys, this is what's there basically. So Diptera on the left hand side here, that's all the different fly species. We've then got Lepidoptera, which is the moths and butterflies. We've got Hemiptera, I had to look some of these up, Hemiptera, which are the bugs, so they're aphids and plant hoppers. Hymenoptera, which are the bees and wasps, and ants also come into that as well. The Coleoptera are the beetles, and then everything else is other stuff. As you can see, there's a wide range of it there, and it's not all stuff that I recognise, but I trust in the science, and I'll show you some of the notable species to make it a little bit more understandable. So these are the notable species from West Kent Golf Course. So we've got this beetle species here. It's a nationally notable species, as well as these two different fly species, both nationally notable, so not found anywhere and everywhere. The small heath butterfly, which is a near threatened butterfly, again not found everywhere, and this dark blood beetle, which is a rare a dark blood bee, sorry, which is a rare bee. So they were quite excited about being able to find records of that on the site. So the information that's gained from having these species on site will then help to inform whether there's certain things that we need to do in terms of management, or if there's all of this information can then be uploaded into the DNA databases and used to support other investigations on other sites as well. The other kind of surveying that took place as part of the project was transects, which are the weekly butterfly walks that take place on green sites nationally. The hope had been that we'd be able to train a lot more people in transect surveying, but with COVID being what it was, it meant that we weren't able to do that. But wherever possible, we involved the Keeping It Wild trainees, who I mentioned before, were involved in doing transects weekly, and wherever possible, volunteers were able to join in with those as and when they could. And the Big Butterfly Count, which is Butterfly Conservation Initiative every summer, on our guided walks, we were able to get people involved with that and doing counts, and also during the volunteer sessions as well. And having that as a kind of hook to get people interested in counting and looking at butterflies was really important, because the more, as you'll know with butterflies, the more you look, the more you see, and often people just haven't looked at the butterflies, so they don't know what they're looking at necessarily. And you can give them a sheet and on a guided walk and have a talk with them about what they're seeing, and it really does bring joy. This picture on the left hand side here was taken after a butterfly walk at Dollopers Hill in Old Coulsdon, and it was another one that started off in the mizzle, and then the sun burned through, and it was just like, felt like clouds of butterflies, it was glorious sunshine, and the walkers were so delighted that, you know, they're clutching their sheets and sort of identifying some of these butterflies that they hadn't noticed before. It was really great. So coming to a summary, our key achievements from the project. We have restored 42 hectares of chalk grassland habitat, which, when you think about that figure at the beginning of London Wildlife Trust, it's almost 10% of the area that London Wildlife Trust cover. 4,441 people have been engaged, so that exceeds our original pre-COVID target of 4,400 and well exceeds our post-COVID target of 3,400. Excuse me. 216 species have been identified so far with eDNA surveys, and those are continuing. There's more and more being identified all the time. And 45 new habitats, as I mentioned before, have been created. So again, exceeding that target of 40 habitats. We've also completed 2,654 volunteer hours We've had over 100 community engagement events. So it really is a lot to be celebrated at the end of this project. And it's been a privilege to be part of it. And thank you very much for listening to everything I've had to say tonight about the project. And now if we can go to some questions, I'll be happy to answer any that I can.